trying to teach from a state of isolation. If it's not good, just use your imagination. Remember, rapping's not my occupation. Mr. Captain giving you an education. Yeah? Right? Right? I think so.
To what extent should we embrace an ideology? Is resistance to liberalism ever justified? To what extent is communism a valid response to liberalism? Today we're going to focus on one question. How is communism in the Soviet Union a rejection of liberalism? We've already talked about the techniques of authoritarian states and how they maintain control through extensive local, regional, and national organization, forced participation, secret police using terror, indoctrination through education and propaganda, censorship of media, and redirecting popular discontent, often using scapegoats. As we talk about authoritarianism in the Soviet Union, keep track of the techniques they use so we can compare them to Nazi Germany in a future lesson. We'll start with understandings of communism, then move on to the Russian Revolution and the beginning of communism in the Soviet Union, understandings of Leninism, and understandings of Stalinism. Remember that we're talking about liberalism and how communism is a rejection of liberal ideas. This lesson is going to be an overview. There's a lot more information out there about the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union, Lenin, and Stalin, so I'll include some links to some videos that might help you out if you want to get a fuller understanding of those things. We've talked lots about socialism in past lessons. If you look at this flowchart, you can see on one side the more moderate forms of socialism, on the other side the more radical. We're going to follow this flowchart through Marxism and communism down to Leninism and Stalinism. And along the way, we're going to see some pretty awesome facial hair. I've always admired Karl Marx, not necessarily his ideology, but his beard and his hair. I'm even working on my Karl Marx beard right now. Can't you tell? You get a good look there. Anyways, Karl Marx was known as a scientific socialist. He had a bit of a plan or a prediction for how things were going to go. Capitalism would emerge from feudalism. Violent conflict occurs between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the proletariat wins. Then the victorious proletariat establishes a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is also evolutionary in nature. You can see where the science is coming here. A centrally planned economy is established. Income is distributed according to the value of work performed. Economic equality is established. Social classes gradually disappear. People work for societal good rather than personal gain, and eventually the state withers away, and what's left is a classless society. Communism can be split into three subsets of ideas: political, economic, and social. In the political idea category, workers will revolt and overthrow the wealthy. The state will be governed by a communist party, political structure will have less hierarchy, and there'll be more collective form of government, with better representation for all people. The economic ideas consisted of collective ownership of the means of production, like resources, land, farms, capital. Private property will be abolished and incomes will be equalized. And social ideas, like a classless society being created, women having equal rights, and cooperation instead of competition. You can see a bunch of rejections of liberal ideas within that chart. So why did Russia become the Soviet Union? Well, in the 1800s, most citizens, about 80%, were poor peasants, known as serfs, who lived in poverty while others profited. There's lots of inequality, and this led to the distrust of capitalism. The Tsar Nicholas, was ruthless, inefficient, authoritarian, persecuted dissidents, and World War I in the early 1900s led to the death and starvation of many people. Out of this discontent, and with knowledge of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, goateed revolutionary Vladimir Lenin emerged with a promise for a better future for the workers through a revolution: land, peace, bread. I'm aware that I glanced over the Russian Revolution in like 10 seconds. There's a lot of other good videos out there that'll give you a more detailed explanation of what happened. But here are some highlights. 1905, Bloody Sunday. People marched to the palace in protest, and it resulted in the Tsar's soldiers opening fire on a crowd and killing hundreds. The aftermath included a few reforms, but not enough to satisfy the people. World War I further intensified problems as Russians suffered. In 1917, a violent revolution took place where Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, and a civil war followed. By 1922, Leninism, Lenin's version of communism, was established. And in 1924, Soviet Union, the USSR, was created from the Union of Communist Russia and other republics. The Communist Party had total control. As I mentioned, the development of communism in the Soviet Union is a complex issue. There's a lot of history there, some significant world events, and a lot of change. Feel free to check out some of the links I've provided to other YouTube videos for more information about those events. I'm going to keep it pretty basic, as this video is an overview of how the Soviet Union is a rejection of liberalism. The Communist Party and Lenin capitalized on social conditions going on in Russia at the time, but they also used propaganda to get their message across. Take a look at this cartoon. Either we kill capital or we die under the heel of capital. The red-shirted, strapping Russian man on the left shows what Russians should do. They should stand up to the villain, stand up to the fat capitalists of the West, or else they'll put an end to us. Let's talk about the Soviet Union under Leninism. It began with a rapid shift to collectivism and public ownership through a policy called war communism. But in 1921, the economy was struggling so much that Lenin introduced the new economic policy, which actually allowed for some small-scale private enterprise in order to stimulate the economy. For example, small farming operations. So the Communist Party and Lenin learned that going real hard at communism was difficult, and they pulled back on the reins a bit and did a tiny shift right with the new economic policy. Karl Marx was probably thinking, come on guys, trust the process. But Leninism is not the same as Marxism. Marxism believed that in the end there'd be no need for government, but Lenin believed that yes, you do need a government, and yes, it must be communist. Lenin's application of Marxist values actually improved the quality of life for many Russians, especially compared to life under the Tsars. And his new economic policy actually allowed for land to be redistributed to the people. Factories were given to workers so that they could make decisions about wages and working conditions. Art and music flourished as there were no longer restrictions on what one could create. At the end of Lenin's life, political turmoil bubbled up. Not all communists believed in his application of Marxist ideas. One of these communists who disagreed with Lenin was Joseph Stalin. When Lenin abruptly died from a stroke, Soviet Union experienced a transition into a new form of communism under Joseph Stalin, the mustachioed man of steel. His form of communism was appropriately known as Stalinism. Stalin's rise to power was not without controversy. Lenin had been highly suspicious of Stalin and did not want him to be the next ruler of the Soviet Union. Following Lenin's death, there was a struggle for power between a guy named Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky had been an ally of Lenin and shared his interpretation of Marxist ideas, so he opposed Stalin's leadership. By 1928, Stalin became the supreme leader of the country. He and his supporters arranged for Trotsky's removal from the Communist Party and for his exile and eventual assassination in Mexico. Stalin was a ruthless competitor. Take a look at these two pictures. There's someone missing from the second one. That person's Trotsky. He was labeled as an enemy of the people after he criticized Stalin's style of leadership. Stalin had all images of and references to Trotsky removed from the Soviet archives, all media and educational materials. What does this say about Stalin's leadership and his beliefs and values? So Stalin establishes Stalinism, his version of communism, and it's brutal, and rejects all values of liberalism in favor of control. He introduces 5-year plans, which are a planned economy, and collectivization of all agriculture. So he undoes some of the new economic plans of Lenin. So what was life like under Stalin? Here are some of the highlights. Prison camps called the Gulag, secret police to control people through terror and force, the purges of 1936 and 1939, during which he eliminated his opponents within the Communist Party, the rewriting of history, the rapid forced industrialization of the country, the collectivization of all farms, through which private farms were taken by force and used to create a collective farming system. Wow. One of the worst things credited to Joseph Stalin was Holodomor, the Ukraine famine. Ukrainian farmers had been resistant to the collectivization of their farms. In 1932, Ukraine experienced a drought, and Stalin withheld grain supplies in what is now considered to be a planned famine. Somewhere between 7 and 10 million people starved. Stalin did this to ruthlessly crush opposition to the state. According to many, Holodomor was a genocide, but not everyone agrees. However, I think it's pretty safe to say that when 7 to 10 million people are starved to death during an artificially created famine, it's pretty horrible. So let's recap this lesson. We started by talking about the origins of communism and the teachings of Karl Marx, the Russian revolutions, how they led to Leninism, and how ultimately ended with Stalinism, and what life was like under the authoritarian rule of these people. This was an overview of some events that took a long time and were a big part of Russian history. I'll provide some links to more information so that you can check those out. But once you're finished, see if you can answer these questions. Why did the people of Russia reject liberalism in favor of a collectivist ideology in the first place? And was the USSR consistent with Marx's communist ideology? Why or why not? And probably the most important question, which Russian had the best facial hair? Keep an eye out for the next lesson, which will be on Nazi Germany and Hitler.
Mr. Captain giving you an education.
Yeah, right?